In 1969, millions of Beatles fans were confronted with a disturbing possibility. Paul McCartney was dead. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that the Beatles were changing or that the old version of Paul had disappeared. According to the theory, Paul McCartney had actually died in a horrific car accident almost 3 years earlier, and the world-famous musician everyone had been watching since then was somebody else. The story claimed that the Beatles knew the truth, their management knew the truth, and the record company knew the truth. Instead of announcing the death of one of the most famous musicians on the planet, they supposedly decided to hide it. They found a man who looked remarkably similar to Paul, taught him to behave like Paul, play bass like Paul, sing like Paul, and somehow continue writing songs at an extraordinary level. Then, according to believers, the remaining Beatles began leaving clues because they could not live with the secret.
Those clues were supposedly everywhere, hidden in lyrics, buried in album artwork, visible in photographs, and even concealed inside recordings that revealed disturbing messages when played backwards. It sounds ridiculous today, but by the autumn of 1969, thousands of people in the United States were genuinely examining Beatles records, photographs, and album covers, convinced they were uncovering one of the biggest secrets in music history.
The conspiracy supposedly begins on November 9, 1966. According to the most popular version of the story, Paul left a recording session after an argument with the other Beatles and drove away alone. Somewhere along the journey, he supposedly picked up a young woman who suddenly realized she was sitting next to Paul McCartney. She became excited, Paul became distracted, and the car crashed. Some versions claim that Paul died instantly. Others went much further, claiming that his injuries were so severe that his face had been destroyed, making it impossible for the public to see the body. There is no credible evidence that this crash ever happened, but 1966 really was a major turning point for the Beatles, and that helped the story enormously. In August of that year, the group played their final commercial concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They stopped touring, withdrew from the constant public appearances that had defined Beatlemania, and began spending far more time in the studio. When they fully re-emerged, they looked completely different. The matching suits and carefully styled mop-top haircuts were disappearing. The Beatles now had mustaches, longer hair, colorful clothing, and a much more experimental image. Their music had changed just as dramatically. To anyone already prepared to believe that something strange had happened, this transformation could be interpreted in a completely different way. Maybe Paul had not changed at all. Maybe this was no longer Paul. Every good conspiracy needs a replacement, and this one eventually acquired a man usually called William Campbell, William Shears Campbell, or Billy Shears. According to the legend, Campbell had won a Paul McCartney look-alike competition and was secretly recruited to replace him. This would already require an extraordinary resemblance, but the theory asks us to believe something even more impressive. The replacement not only looked like Paul, but also learned to sing almost exactly like him, play bass left-handed, play piano, compose songs, and behave convincingly enough to fool Paul's family, friends, bandmates, journalists, and millions of fans. There is no credible evidence that such a replacement ever existed, but believers soon found what they considered far more important than conventional evidence. They found Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper in 1967, its album cover offered conspiracy theorists an almost unlimited amount of material. The cover shows the Beatles surrounded by dozens of famous figures, flowers, and unusual objects. To most people, it was simply an elaborate piece of psychedelic pop art. To supporters of the Paul is dead theory, it looked like a funeral.
The flowers in front of the group were interpreted as a grave. A yellow floral arrangement was said to resemble a left-handed bass guitar, which immediately became significant because Paul was left-handed. The entire cover began to be read not as a colorful celebration, but as a memorial. Then there was the badge on Paul's uniform. Some believers claimed that the letters on it were OPD, which they interpreted as officially pronounced dead. That sounds wonderfully sinister, except the badge is generally identified as an Ontario provincial police badge bearing the letters OPP. Still, once the theory had taken hold, a slightly unclear letter was more than enough to keep it alive. Another supposedly meaningful detail was the hand positioned above Paul's head. In certain cultures and religious images, a raised hand can be interpreted symbolically, and conspiracy theorists quickly connected it with death. Similar visual coincidences appeared elsewhere in Beatles photography, but within the logic of the theory, anything positioned near Paul became suspicious.
One of the strangest clues involved the Sgt. Pepper drum. Fans claimed that if a mirror was placed horizontally across the words "Lonely Hearts," the reflection produced a mysterious message that could be interpreted as "I 1-9-I he die." Supporters connected 1-9-I with November 9th, the supposed date of Paul's fatal crash. The interpretation requires a fair amount of imagination, but that became part of the attraction. Fans were not simply listening to albums anymore, they were decoding them. Sgt. Pepper also introduced another important name, Billy Shears. At the end of the title track, the audience is introduced to Billy Shears just before Ringo Starr begins singing "With a Little Help from My Friends." In the actual context of the album, Billy Shears is simply part of the fictional Sgt. Pepper concept. But for conspiracy believers, the name became attached to the mysterious replacement. Suddenly, the supposed substitute for Paul seemed to have been mentioned directly on a Beatles record. The theory became even easier to expand because the Beatles' music itself was becoming increasingly experimental. Their recordings featured tape loops, unusual studio effects, reversed sound, surreal lyrics, and deliberately ambiguous phrases. If a band was ever going to accidentally provide material for a conspiracy theory, the Beatles in the late 1960s were almost perfectly designed for it. One famous example came from Strawberry Fields Forever. Near the end of the song, John Lennon can be heard saying something quietly in the background. Some listeners became convinced that he was saying, "I buried Paul." That would obviously be an extraordinary clue if it were true. The phrase is generally understood to be cranberry sauce, but once somebody tells you to listen for "I buried Paul," it becomes surprisingly easy to hear exactly that. This is one of the reasons the conspiracy became so powerful. Human hearing is extremely suggestible when dealing with unclear sounds. If you hear an ambiguous recording with no context, your brain may struggle to interpret it. But if somebody tells you exactly what you were supposed to hear, the words can suddenly seem obvious. Magical Mystery Tour provided more material. In one photograph, 3 Beatles are wearing red carnations while Paul is wearing a black one. The explanation was simple. They had run out of red carnations. But within the conspiracy, Paul's black flower became another symbol of death. By this stage, coincidence was no longer really allowed to exist. Then came the White Album and John Lennon's Glass Onion. Lennon sings that he has another clue for the listener and then says the walrus was Paul. Fans searching for evidence immediately treated the line as significant. Lennon, however, had a habit of deliberately confusing people who tried to find deep meanings in every Beatles lyric. In other words, while fans were obsessively searching for hidden clues, Lennon was actively feeding them more nonsense because he found the whole process amusing. That decision probably did not help. The White Album also contained one of the most important recordings in the entire Paul is Dead mythology, Revolution 9. Even without a conspiracy theory, the track sounds unsettling. It is an experimental sound collage made from voices, noises, tape loops, and fragments of audio, with the words "number 9" repeated again and again. Fans discovered that when the repeated "number 9" phrase was played backwards, it sounded vaguely like "Turn Me On, Dead Man." That became one of the most famous alleged backwards messages in rock history. Other sections were also reversed and interpreted as containing references to death, accidents, and Paul. Today, reversing audio takes seconds. In 1969, fans were physically manipulating records and tape machines to search for hidden messages. That detail alone shows how intensely people became involved. They were not simply hearing a rumor and repeating it, they were actively searching through Beatles material looking for confirmation. The phenomenon is a classic example of auditory pareidolia, the tendency to hear meaningful words or patterns inside ambiguous sounds. Once a listener has been told what a reversed phrase supposedly says, it becomes much easier to hear it. The brain fills in the gaps. Despite all these supposed clues, the Paul is dead theory was still mostly an underground rumor. That changed dramatically in 1969. On September 17th, the student newspaper of Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa published an article by Tim Harper discussing the possibility that Paul McCartney was dead. It is widely considered one of the earliest known printed accounts of the rumor. Harper was not claiming to have discovered the conspiracy himself. He was writing about a story already circulating among students. That is important because the precise origin of Paul is Dead is difficult to identify. It spread like a traditional urban legend. Somebody heard it from somebody else who had supposedly heard it from somebody with inside information. The story grew as it moved from person to person. Then, on October 12, 1969, Detroit radio presenter Russ Gibb received a phone call during his program on WKNR-FM. The caller told him that Paul McCartney was dead and that Beatles records contained clues proving it. Gibb discussed the theory live on air, and listeners immediately began calling with their own interpretations. This was the moment when the rumor became something much bigger. Once the theory reached radio, thousands of people could investigate it simultaneously. Every listener could look at an album cover, play a record backwards, and contribute another supposed clue. 2 days later, University of Michigan student Fred Labor published an article titled "McCartney Dead: New Evidence Brought to Light." The article helped organize many of the clues into a coherent story and push the conspiracy even further into the mainstream. But there was a remarkable detail. Labor later admitted that he had invented several of the clues himself. He was effectively having fun with the story, exaggerating it and adding material. Yet some of those invented details were repeated elsewhere as if they were genuine evidence. The conspiracy was now feeding itself. People were creating clues, other people were reporting them, and then new audiences were treating those reports as confirmation that the theory must have some basis. Then came Abbey Road. The album had been released only weeks earlier, and its famous cover quickly became the single most important image in the entire conspiracy. 4 Beatles walking across a zebra crossing suddenly became, in the eyes of believers, a carefully staged funeral procession. John Lennon is walking first, dressed entirely in white. He was interpreted as the priest. Ringo Starr follows him wearing a dark suit, supposedly representing the Undertaker. Paul comes next and is interpreted as the corpse. George Harrison, dressed in denim, walks last and becomes the gravedigger. Taken individually, none of this means very much, but when presented as a complete sequence, the image is strangely effective. Once you are told that the photograph represents a funeral, it becomes difficult not to see the pattern. Paul himself provided several more famous clues. He is barefoot, which conspiracy theorists claimed represented a corpse being prepared for burial. He is also out of step with the other Beatles. While the others appear to have one leg forward, Paul seems to be moving differently. For believers, this suggested that he did not truly belong with the group. Then there is the cigarette in his hand. Paul McCartney is famously left-handed, but in the Abbey Road photograph, he appears to be holding the cigarette in his right hand. That became another piece of supposed evidence that the man in the picture was an imposter. Of course, being left-handed does not make someone physically incapable of holding an object in their right hand, but by this stage, ordinary explanations were not particularly attractive. The most famous Abbey Road clue is probably the Volkswagen Beetle parked in the background. Its number plate appears to contain the characters 28I've. Conspiracy theorists interpreted this as a message saying that Paul would have been 28 years old if he were still alive. There is just one obvious problem. Paul was born in June 1942. When Abbey Road was photographed and released in 1969, he was 27, not 28. Different explanations were created to solve this problem, including alternative ways of counting age, but the fact that the number did not actually match rarely damaged the popularity of the clue. By late 1969, the conspiracy had everything it needed. There was a supposed fatal accident, a secret replacement, coded lyrics, reversed recordings, funeral imagery, mysterious symbols, and one of the most famous album covers in history. There was only one major problem. Paul McCartney was alive. During much of the frenzy, Paul had been spending time away from the public eye at his farm in Scotland with Linda McCartney and their family. His relative absence from the media actually helped the rumor grow. If Paul had been appearing constantly on television, it would have been more difficult to create the impression that something mysterious was happening. Eventually, journalists decided to find him. Life magazine located McCartney in Scotland and photographed him with his family. In November 1969, the magazine published a cover story making the situation fairly clear. Paul was still alive. That should have ended everything. It did not. This is one of the most interesting characteristics of conspiracy theories. Once a theory becomes sufficiently flexible, evidence against it can be absorbed into the theory itself. If Paul appears in public, believers can simply say that the man appearing in public is the replacement. If he gives an interview, the replacement has been trained. If he writes brilliant music, that only proves how talented the replacement must be. The better the supposed fake Paul performs, the more impressive the conspiracy becomes. So why did so many people believe it? Part of the answer is timing. Between 1966 and 1969, the Beatles transformed dramatically. They stopped touring, their appearance changed, their music became more experimental. Their album covers became increasingly complex and symbolic. Their lyrics became stranger. They were almost inviting interpretation.
The late 1960s were also a period of enormous social tension. The Vietnam War, political assassinations, protests, and growing distrust of governments and institutions created an environment in which secret plots felt more believable than they might have a decade earlier. But there is another explanation that is much simpler. People love patterns. Once someone tells you that Paul McCartney is dead, every ambiguous detail starts to look meaningful. A black flower is no longer just a black flower. Bare feet are no longer just bare feet. A police badge becomes a coded death announcement. A Volkswagen number plate becomes a message. A strange voice at the end of a song becomes a confession.
The question changes from, is there evidence that Paul died, to what can I interpret as evidence that Paul died? Those are two very different questions. That is also why the conspiracy became entertaining. Fans were not simply consuming the story, they were participating in it. Anyone with a Beatles album could become an investigator. Every cover, lyric, and photograph offered the possibility of discovering something nobody else had noticed. The Beatles themselves were well aware of the theory, and over the years, Paul occasionally played with it. In 1993, he released a live album titled Paul is Live, an obvious joke about the old rumor. The cover also returned him to the Abbey Road zebra crossing. This time, Paul was wearing shoes.
The joke was obvious, but the conspiracy had already become too culturally important to disappear. Decades later, people still compare photographs of Paul before and after 1966, analyzing his teeth, ears, height, voice, and facial proportions in an attempt to prove that two different men are involved. At that point, the theory becomes almost impossible to falsify. If the supposed replacement has successfully maintained Paul's identity for more than half a century, released classic albums, performed thousands of concerts, and remained in the public eye for decades, then the replacement would have achieved one of the greatest performances in human history.
The actual evidence is far less dramatic. There is no credible documentation showing that Paul McCartney died in a car accident in November 1966. There is no credible evidence that the Beatles recruited a replacement. There is no reliable record of a William Campbell assuming Paul's identity. Many of the famous clues appeared only after the rumor was already spreading, and some of them were openly invented. That is what makes Paul is Dead such a fascinating story. The mystery is not really whether Paul McCartney died. He did not. The mystery is how a collection of unrelated photographs, lyrics, coincidences, jokes, and misunderstood sounds became one of the most famous conspiracy theories in popular culture. And all of this happened decades before social media.
There was no Twitter, no Reddit, no TikTok, no YouTube algorithm pushing conspiracy videos to millions of people. The rumor spread through university newspapers, radio stations, magazines, conversations between fans, and people physically examining their own records. In a strange way, Paul is Dead was an early example of viral culture. More than half a century later, the story is still alive. The Beatles broke up. John Lennon and George Harrison really did die. Entire generations have grown up since the original rumor. Paul McCartney has continued recording, touring, and appearing in public for decades. And somehow, Paul is Dead survived all of it. Today, you do not need to believe the theory to understand why it became so compelling. It combines celebrity, mystery, death, coded messages, hidden identities, and one of the most analyzed bands in history. Most importantly, it demonstrates how powerful suggestion can be. Look at the Abbey Road cover without knowing anything about the conspiracy, and you see 4 musicians crossing a street. Then, somebody tells you that John is the priest, Ringo is the undertaker, Paul is the corpse, and George is the gravedigger. You notice the bare feet. You notice the cigarette. You notice the Volkswagen. And suddenly, a completely ordinary photograph starts to feel strangely deliberate. That is the real secret behind Paul is Dead. Not that the Beatles successfully replaced Paul McCartney and hid his death from the world, but that once the human brain is given a pattern, it becomes very difficult to stop looking for it. And by the way, Paul McCartney is still alive. Unless, of course, that is exactly what Billy Shears wants us to think.